I was testifying before Congress the other day on behalf of Judicial Watch about protecting the right to vote during the coronavirus crisis. Now, of course, I don't think there's a coronavirus crisis anymore, so you can imagine what my attitude was. But the hearing was set up with the subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee. The chairman of the Judiciary Committee is Congressman Nadler from New York. The subcommittee chairman is Congressman Cohen from Tennessee, both of them are Democrats. Congressman Jordan is the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee for the Republicans. And I am forgetting, Lord help me, the name of the ranking member on the House Judiciary Committee. I'll probably figure it out. The committee testified. So I was invited to testify. Our friend Christian Adams was invited to testify. He's one of the only other groups. He runs one of the only other groups that involves itself in trying to clean up and secure elections, as opposed to try to undermine their security. And I think the majority staff had 5 or 6 witnesses. So 2 witnesses on our side, 5 or 6 witnesses on the other, and of course it's run by the Democrats. They won, so they run it. So I don't complain about that. And it was a telework or a teleconference, like a web Zoom type of hearing, which I don't like. There's no reason to have it. Congress should be meeting in person, not. There's no reason, health-wise or otherwise. And frankly, it's suspicious constitutionally when they don't meet in person. But nevertheless, they held the committee hearing, and my guess is they were not too pleased with the way it went. Because who was the lead and the star witness for the leftists on the committee? It was Stacey Abrams, who lost the seat for governor in Georgia, and has made a career since then of falsely accusing Georgia of engaging in voter suppression in terms of stealing the election from her, when in fact that did not take place at all, and now trying to upend our election system by requiring vote-by-mail requirements and upending voter ID and security for 2020 and beyond. And I testified really quite strongly about what we should be doing, and I'm gonna kind of go through what I testified about. Let's see here. One of the problems of doing this during the coronavirus is I don't have my paper. I have to rely on this old thing I have. And I'm going to go through my testimony because you probably won't hear it anywhere else. Probably won't go over and watch it. But I think it's important because we're facing a rule of law crisis. As I say, our Republicans are under assault. I don't think elections aren't part of the target. I don't think they don't want to be able to set up the steal in 2020. I start off, for years, Americans have been losing faith in the integrity of our electoral process. Many polls have been taken on this subject, and they reach the same conclusion. The Gallup organization conducts a particularly interesting poll, which compares American attitudes with those of other countries. The poll asks respondents if they have confidence in the honesty of elections. Last year, only 40% of Americans answered yes, while an astonishing 59% said no. Gallup reports that a majority of Americans have consistently lacked confidence in the honesty of elections every year since 2012. Among the explanations for this loss of faith, we must include the public's impatience with the politicization of election procedure, and in particular, the dubious objections to what are widely perceived to be common sense election integrity measures. The most obvious example to date concerns the fight against voter ID laws. There's strong bipartisan support for voter ID laws. I think there were 76 in favor in a major poll. The support is understandable in a society where one must produce identification for so many different reasons, from getting on a plane to buying prescription drugs to working out an agenda. But voter ID laws are so often opposed with significant success by political operatives, it's a sign of our times. The opposition often relies on unsupported claims that voter ID will depress minority turnout, but this effect is never seen in actual elections. Opponents also try to flip the burden of proof, arguing in effect that unless those favoring voter ID can prove that voter fraud is a common occurrence that costs elections, there is no justification for requiring an ID. This argument is bogus. As the Supreme Court has noted, regardless of the prevalence of fraud, states have an obvious legitimate, quote, interest in counting only the votes of eligible voters and in carefully identifying all voters participating in the election process. This interest is justified by the nature of voter fraud, which is hard to detect or punish after the fact. Think about it. It's hard to figure out if someone committed voter fraud. On a more practical note, those expressing doubt about the existence of voter fraud reveal an unrealistic, if touching view of human nature. People cheat at more or less at everything. They cheat at baseball, they cheat at sumo wrestling. Yes, they do cheat at sumo wrestling. They cheat when it doesn't matter. For instance, in online gaming or internet chess. They even cheat at solitaire. Yeah, people cheat at solitaire. So they're not competing against anybody other than a deck of cards. Why do they think voting is any less subject to cheating, especially given the intense partisan and financial feeling, enthusiasm, and interest? There are many, many examples of common sense election integrity laws that partisans have made the subject of unnecessary and manufactured opposition. And when I say partisans, I mean leftists. By far the silliest example is a 2017 Virginia state bill that would have required electronic poll books to contain the photograph already taken by the Department of Motor Vehicles for each registered voter who has a driver's license. So that way they can check the ID. Note that the actual photograph of a voter taken by the DMV cannot possibly discriminate against that voter, yet then Governor McAuliffe vetoed the bill. And since then, you've had a new governor come in, by the way, Governor Northam, who has eviscerated the voter ID law in Virginia with the approval of the legislature. My point here is that the American people see what they conclude as disingenuous fights and lose faith in the honesty of our elections. Because when someone is obviously just trying to oppose something so that they're able to game the system, why do you think the system isn't going to be rigged? With this background in mind, I turn to measures proposed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the most common suggestions now is to require greater reliance on mail-in ballots. For example, last month, Governor Newsom issued an executive order requiring that county election officials transmit mail ballots to every registered voter in the state. I view this as a real threat to the integrity of our elections. In 2005, my point, in 2005, I lost my train of thought. In 2005, you had a bipartisan consensus against mail-in votes because they're known to be susceptible to fraud. You had Jimmy Carter and James Baker, who was then a big Republican. Jimmy Carter, of course, the former Democratic president. They had a commission that looked at this issue. This is what they concluded. Absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud. Absentee balloting is vulnerable to abuse in several ways. Blank ballots mailed to the wrong address or to large residential buildings might get intercepted. Citizens who vote at home, at nursing homes, at the workplace, or in church are more susceptible to pressure, overt and subtle, or to intimidation. Hence the objections to ballot harvesting. Vote buying schemes are far more difficult to detect when citizens vote by mail. What does that mean? Vote buying schemes are harder to detect. People buying votes, if they're able to do it away from a polling place, it's a lot easier. While I share all these concerns, I'd like to focus on the problem of ballots mailed So the wrong address. Voter registration lists throughout the country are routinely out of date, containing registrations from voters who are no longer live at the stated address, who have died, who are eligible under the law to vote for to vote for some other reason. So they're not eligible to vote. This has been a problem for years. A Pew Research Center report back during the Obama years noted that approximately, listen to this number, 2.75 million people have active registrations in more than one state. And you probably know some of those people. People who used to live in your house, who, like your kids who've grown up and moved away, you're still getting their registration material at your house, even though you know they're voting somewhere else. 24 million, 1 out of every 8 active voter registrations in the United States are no longer valid or significantly inaccurate. 24 million. 1.8 million deceased individuals listed as active voters. Active voters. You know what that means? You got dead people voting. And things haven't gotten much better since this Pew Center, I suspect. Well, maybe they've gotten a little bit better because Judicial Watch has come to the rescue. In particular, counties throughout the county, we know about the problem because Judicial Watch, as I said, has come to the rescue. Because we've been enforcing the National Voter Registration Act, which requires states to take reasonable steps to clean up the rolls. As I said before, in 2019, we did an analysis, counties across the country. We looked at those counties that had more people on the rolls than living there and eligible to vote, meaning over 100% of the voting age population was registered. And when you add up all those extra names, you come to 2.5 million names. And that's just the tip of the iceberg about the number of bad names on the registration list nationally. There's high numbers of inactive registrations that have not been canceled as the law requires. The registration becomes inactive when a registrant is sent and fails to respond to an address confirmation notice. And if that registrant does not vote or otherwise contact election officials for the next 2 general federal elections from 2 to 4 years. The registration is supposed to be canceled. It's not being done. And during that period of, hey, where are you? Your registration is called inactive, but you still can vote because you're still registered. So will the mail-in ballots go to inactive voters? That's the concern. And as I said, inactive voters just don't, there's a major issue with the voter list generally, but the inactive voters are kind of just sitting out there. It's really quite obvious. It's crucial to note that inactive voters can still vote on election day. This does not even require the voter to use a provisional ballot. It means that there's no challenge. You're on the list, you vote. The voter need only affirm his or her address, and in many states that can be done orally. No ID required. To be clear, the poll worker asks the voter if he or she lives at the listed address, and the voter says yes. At that point, the voter can vote. Now consider our experience in Los Angeles County. I've gone over this before. We have a settlement with them. They're in the process of removing up to 1.6 million extra names from their rolls. 1.6 million extra names from their rolls. And the process won't be completed until 2022. So there will be names removed before then, but all of them at issue won't be handled until 2022 because I said there's this process in place. Now, Governor Newsom's executive order, which we're challenging in court, would have sent ballots to all of those names. Dead people, people who moved away. We've sued to stop it. He since has changed his executive order to suggest he won't be mailing it to the inactive names, but it doesn't answer the issue about just sending ballots by the millions without permission from the legislature as the Constitution requires and flooding the system at this late stage in our election process. They want to break the system. That's what I'm convinced is happening here. You know, one of the main reasons the Carter-Baker Commission identified absentee ballots as the largest source of potential voter fraud is simple. It poses fewer risks for a person filling out and mailing a fraudulent ballot. By contrast, a person attempting impersonation fraud at a polling site must at least appear to cast the vote, and in consequence may be found out and detained. So there is a little bit of a risk of showing up to vote illegally, even if there is no voter ID required. Who knows? Just last week, a West Virginia postal worker was indicted for manipulating 8 voters' absentee ballots. 2019, an Oakland County clerk outside Detroit was charged with illegally altering 193 absentee ballots. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, a man was charged with helping 13 others falsely falsify absentee ballots ahead of the 2018 election. I can go on. And there was a Republican in North Carolina, I think he doing illegal ballot harvesting involving 1,200 votes, all of which were absentee. 2017, a Dallas County man was convicted after 700 mail-in ballots were witnessed and signed by a fictitious person. Yes, Virginia, voter fraud is real. At a final, you know, it's about 5 months till election day. The pandemic is on the wane. Insisting now that all mail ballot elections seems less a response to a health crisis than a partisan application of the infamous words of Rahm Emanuel. Never allow a good crisis to go to waste. You know, Governor Newsom's order is particularly cynical because he's pretending that there's a health crisis that requires this change in law. But he's not doing anything about ballot harvesting, which requires people to in person go and collect ballots. So if he was so concerned about people's health, he would change that. Now, I want to be clear. We had Stacey Abrams giving testimony. We had other members of Congress making the same point as well during the testimony. And I pushed back. This is what I pushed back on. I pushed back on the fear-mongering by people like Stacey Abrams, who go around and say, without challenge, people shouldn't have to choose dying over voting. It's that type of fear-mongering that suppresses the right to vote, that suppresses voters from coming out and voting. That's the voter suppression. The left accuses us of suppressing the vote. That's garbage. We're just trying to make sure that votes are secure. That increases people's willingness to vote. But when you have leftists out there trying to scare people to death from voting, that's suppressive. I mean, you can see from the protests this week, if someone considers a civil right important, they will exercise it no matter what the risk. We were told that it was risky to do this during coronavirus. Yet you see Americans exercising their rights. Who in their right mind would get in the way of people peaceably assembling? And you'll be able to vote in person. If you want your vote to be counted and you want it to be secure, you're going to go vote in person. Now, yes, mail-in ballots are available. Absentee ballots are available. The laws don't need to be changed. Yes, there are secure methods. They're trying to increase security for absentee ballots. But the best way to be sure that your vote is counted, you vote in person. Everything else is more susceptible to fraud and intimidation. And just plain incompetence getting in the way of your vote getting counted. There's no perfect way to vote, admittedly. The best way to vote is in person. So if anything, we should be frowning upon vote by mail and encouraging people to exercise the franchise in person. We should be increasing security at polling places, increasing the sanctity of the vote by making voter ID a requirement nationally. I'm not saying pass a national law. I don't know if that can be done under the Constitution. I'm saying state by state. I mean, the left would have you believe everywhere in our country is being, all these voters are being suppressed by voter ID. It's simply not true. 15 major states have no voter ID. And by major states, I mean states like California, Illinois, Pennsylvania, I think New Jersey, New York, places like that. Only 10 or 11 states have strict voter ID, meaning essentially, if you don't have a voter ID or a photo ID or something substantial, you can't really vote. You might be able to submit a provisional ballot, but you got to show up pretty darn soon after the election with the proper ID. Most other states have what they call voter ID, but they're weak. That's just a variation of how weak they are. Some are better than others, but only 10 or 11 states have strict voter ID laws. So our elections are largely unsecured, So these were some of the points I was making during the testimony. And I don't think too many of the left like it. Many people, I don't think I've ever heard the point that scaring people from voting in person, using fake science and fake concerns about coronavirus is suppressing the right to vote and will suppress voter turnout. Those are the people who need to be held accountable. So in the meantime, Judicial Watch will continue to do the heavy lifting. We have that case in California over Newsom's scheme to illegally mail votes, ballots. We're suing on behalf of voters and Congressman or former Congressman Darrell Issey. He's trying to get back into office now. We have suits in North Carolina and Pennsylvania to clean up about 2 million names between the two of those states. I don't know how they're going to turn out. And more is coming. So Judicial Watch, once again, I was proud to represent you to Congress, and I appreciate the Democrats allowing me to testify. I was obviously invited by the Republicans to come in, but Congressman Cohen, he ran a very fair hearing, and I encourage you to watch the hearing. And we're all very respectful to each other. It was very civil, and Congress, the leftists in Congress are trying to push this national vote by mail plan and undo election security throughout the nation. They're unlikely to do it, but now it's a state by state battle. So I encourage you to track this issue because, everything we're talking about in terms of taxes, the size of government, all policies that you hear about out of Washington, that's all your concerns about it are be all for naught if they can steal elections, if your vote isn't counted. So it's a core issue, and it's part of the attack on the Republic on our left is to undo our any semblance of the light security we have around secured voting here in the United States of America.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch all the latest news from Judicial Watch.